Greetings, and we are having a video presentation today, short video here, and we're going to deal with how long is a generation according to the Scriptures. Now, there in Matthew 24:34, most people are familiar with the chapter 24 of Matthew, and it says there in verse 34, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So, everything he said before verse 34 was to take place before this generation passes away, as this indicates here. We'll get into this as we move along. Now, many teach we are the end-time generation, according to Matthew 24:34, and connect it to the rebirth of Israel as a nation in 1948. Now, it has been taught that the generation, those living, that saw Israel become a nation back in 1948 will be the generation that will see the second coming of Jesus Christ. This is what is taught and has been taught. Many people still teach this. Look it up. Do a YouTube search or a Google search on the fig tree, and you'll see what I'm talking about. We're going to explain that in a moment. So many teach Israel is referred to as this fig tree in the following verse. Here in Matthew 24:32, same chapter. "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When its branch is still tender and puts out leaves, you know that summer is near." Jesus goes on, "So you, likewise, when you see all these things, shall know that it is near at the doors." And here's our verse 34 again. "Truly I say to you, this generation shall not pass until all these things are fulfilled." Now the putting out of leaves in verse 32 is believed to be a reference to the rebirth of Israel as a nation in 1948. Now Israel plays a huge part in the futurist interpretation of Bible prophecy, which is what this is all about, which is why we're dealing with this. Now let's look at what the Bible says about the length of a generation to determine if connecting this to the rebirth of Israel as a nation is scripturally accurate. All right, you'll see how this all comes together as we progress. First scripture is Job 42:16. Says, "After this lived Job 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations." According to this verse, 140 years now is 4 generations, or to the 4th generation, as some versions say. This would make a generation 35 years. Now Matthew 1:17, if you want to look that up, you can stop the video anytime you want, check these things out and pause and pray and look at these verses and such. But Matthew 1:17 gives us some very crucial insight and information about the length of a generation. Now, in the generations leading to Jesus' birth, as this verse mentions here, 42 different generations are listed. All right, are made reference to. They're not all 42, I don't believe are all listed, but they're made reference to. Now, the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. So we have 3 sets of 14 generations each that are listed. In calculating the times for each of these sets of 14 generations, we can draw some conclusions as to have an idea of the average length of a generation for each time period. Now I use this book I'm going to try to show here to you in my camera. When and Where in the Bible and Throughout History. There it is. If you want to search that and find that, it's got a whole lot of information. Anyway, that's the book I used to determine what's going to be coming up here in just a moment. All right? So the following dates are estimates. I got them from this book, but if you look in other books, it's probably going to vary a little bit. All right? So this will give us a good idea, though it's harder to say that the dates are exact, but I'd say they're fairly close. All right, so from Abraham was 2166 BC to David 1025 BC. It's around 1,125 years. So you take that number, divide it by 14, the number of generations, and the average length of a generation for this time period is about 80 years. Now, bear in mind, this is a long time ago. We're talking 4,000 years, roughly. All right, so the next one is from David, from 1025 BC to the carrying away of Babylon, 605 BC, or still before Christ. It's about 405 years. Now you divide 405 by 14, the number of generations, and the average length of a generation for this time period is about 30 years. So you see a significant change as you get further in, or closer to our time. Now, the last set of 14 generations here, from the carrying away to Babylon, 605 BC roughly, to Christ around 5 BC, it's about 600 years. Divide this 600 by 14, again the number of generations, and the average length of a generation is about 43 years. So the two time frames closest to the time of Christ factored together make the average length of a generation about 36 years, which is surprisingly close to the 35-year length of a generation referred to in Job 42:16. All right? Now, if you look it up in the third definition of generation that refers to the time, says an age, the time ordinarily occupied by each successive generation, he looks at it and calls it a space of 30 to 33 years. Now, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia defines generation from Luke 21:32 as an age. The average lifetime, once again, we have 33 years, even shorter than we have concluded from those passages of Scriptures. Smith's Bible Dictionary says a generation in relation to biblical modern civilized nations is from 30 to 40 years, citing Job 42:16. So he broadens it out a little bit more, understandably so. Now in Hebrews chapter 3, speaking of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, a connection is made to a generation and a 40-year time period. I'm going to read Hebrews 3 verses 9 and 10 here so you can get an idea what we're talking about. And it says, talking about the wandering in the wilderness and what happened there, it says, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years, wherefore I was grieved with that generation, and said, they do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. All right? So, the Scriptures, scholars, and historical verification all indicate a generation to be, and I'm putting it in a very broad sense here, of 30 to 43 years. Right? Now remember why we started this out. The generation that sees Israel become a nation is said to be the generation that sees the coming of Christ. All right? So when this time frame is put after the rebirth of the nation of Israel, it's clear the speculations that this scenario suggests haven't transpired. All right? Adding this 43 years, and I'm using the longest time frame. I'm not using the 30 or 35 or whatever. I'm using the longest time frame here. If you add the 43 years to 1948, one generation, as these people are saying, the generation that sees Israel become a nation again is the generation that's going to see the coming of Christ. I think Hal Lindsey was the first one started this back in the 70s. So, if we add this to the 1948, you get 1991. If we subtract 7 years for the tribulation and factor in the pre-tribulation rapture, which is the dominant teaching in relation to all this, we would have had a rapture in 1984. Well, we know what conclusion to draw from that, right? Now, even if we start the time in 1967 after the Six-Day War, we had 43 years. Remember, this is the longest time frame based on our conclusions in our little study here, right? If we add this 43 years to 67, we would have the year 2010. Again, if we subtract 7 years for the tribulation and factor in a pre-tribulation rapture, it would have happened in the year 2003. Obviously, we're 11 years past that now, so something is seriously wrong. So it appears all these speculations based on the leaves of the fig tree in Matthew 24:32 being a reference to the rebirth of Israel as a nation, and the length of a generation based on Matthew 24:34, they have all expired. Now, the leaves of the fig tree have nothing to do with Israel becoming a nation again in 1948. The leaves of the fig tree show summer is near, like the signs Jesus gave show the end is near. We deal with this in our Olivet Discourse videos and another one coming up about the coming of the Lord at the end of the age. All right? Now in Luke's account, he says, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they put forth leaves, you know summer is near. All right? So Luke makes reference to the fig tree and all the trees. Would this mean that when every nation became a nation, it's to be a sign of the end? Certainly not. Neither is Israel a sign represented by the fig tree. Obviously, this is a faulty scriptural, teaching and conclusion to use to come to this conclusion, and it's so far expired now that, well, that's why I'm pointing it out so you can see what's going on here and understand these matters. So what then do the signs, the leaves on the fig tree in Matthew 24:31 represent mean? Well, the signs were given in response to the disciples questioning Jesus. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 24 of Matthew. You can also look at this in Mark 13 and Luke 21, if you want to write that down. All right? So they asked the questions after Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. Now the dominant question and the only question in all accounts of the Olivet Discourse, which I said is also Mark 13 and Luke 21, the only question in all these three accounts of this Olivet Discourse was the disciples asking Jesus when the temple would be destroyed. Now speaking of the length of a generation, we termed it around, 30 to 43 years? Well, Jesus predicted the temple to be destroyed and said this generation will not pass till all these things take place, including the destruction of the temple. And guess what? Well, it happened around 40 years later. Once again, verifying this 40-year time frame, roughly, give or take, as the length of a generation. It happened exactly like Jesus said in the time frame that we concluded the Bible is teaching the length of a generation to be. So, along with the dominant question, the disciples asked Jesus about his coming and also about the end of the age. So the big question here, as we conclude this portion of this video, is why did the disciples ask Jesus about his coming at the end of the age? Because they asked this when he predicted the destruction of the temple. Well, first of all, as first century Jews, what would their understanding and concept of Jesus' coming be? It would not be the same as what most people look at thinking about the second coming of Christ to be in our day and age. They didn't even know he was going yet. They thought, and if you look in Acts 1:6, they thought he was going to still set up a kingdom in Israel. And he had already died, buried, resurrected, and right before he ascended they asked him that. So their concept of Jesus coming would be much different than today. Now remember, they only had the Old Testament as Scripture, so anything that is taught about the comings of the Lord and such like that, they would only know scripturally from the Old Testament, because Jesus, when he predicted the destruction of the temple there in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, Luke 21, the New Testament wasn't written yet. They didn't have no New Testament until about 20 years after the church was going on. So they only had the Old Testament at this time. So we would really need to look at what the Old Testament talks about in the coming of the Lord and different things like that to get an idea of what their understanding would be. And we deal with this. We will deal with this in our other video. So also, the end of what age were they asking Jesus about? The age the temple was a huge part of? Well, that's what he predicted the destruction of. Or an age they weren't in, weren't exposed to, and had absolutely no connection to the temple that was predicted to be destroyed, that prompted their question in the first place. That's a pretty complicated question there in the last one, but think about that. What age would they be asking him about when he predicts the destruction of the temple that they were looking at? Pretty easy to draw the conclusion on this matter. All right? So our video on the coming of the Lord and the end of the age deal with this. And there's my email address for anyone that would like to share any comments or questions or anything like that. Would love to hear from you. Thank you for viewing the video, and may God bless you.